Hello, I am Dr. Tim Hartman, and this is your welcome video for H550 Christian Theology 1. It is my joy and privilege to welcome you to this course. We'll do a few introductory details and then get into thinking about the readings for week 1 of Christian Theology 1. So let's jump right into it. Welcome to the adventure. And know that the way that I teach this course is based on questions. Every week is going to have a question that the topic is shaped around. So we're going to be familiar with all sorts of questions: where, what, who, when, why, how. So I've got plenty of questions, and I hope that each one of you is bringing questions as well. And if you don't have questions yet, they're going to come. And so really look forward to hearing your questions, to engaging your questions with the authors that we're going to read from throughout Christian history. As together we seek to better understand who God is and the ways that God is at work in this world. So a who question: who are your instructors for this term? I am Reverend Tim Hartman, PhD. I teach theology here at Columbia Seminary. I'm beginning my 10th year, about to complete a decade of teaching theology at Columbia Seminary. And then also our teaching assistant is Reverend Brittany Fiscus Van Rossum. Brittany is an alum of Columbia Seminary and has served as a pastor at Mercy Church for a number of years, and is now in the PhD program in Ethics and Society in the Graduate Department of Religion at Emory University. So I'm just thrilled that Brittany is a guide on this journey as well. And then you'll hear a voice. You won't get to meet Dr. Martha Moore-Kish this semester, but you will hear her weekly on the podcasts. She's on sabbatical this fall. She's the J.B. Green Professor of Theology here at Columbia. She's the other theology professor along with me. We teach this class together most years, and this fall she's on sabbatical. She'll return this spring, and we'll teach Christian Theology 2 together. But know that you will hear her voice and you will get to know her and her insights as the semester goes on. So as I said, we're thinking about questions, and we want to think with a number of authors and theologians throughout the semester. One of those authors is James Cone. James Cone lived from 1938 to 2018. He served many of his years working as professor of systematic theology at Union Theological Seminary in New York City. He was a leader in the African Methodist Episcopal Church and wrote 11 books. The one we'll be reading this year, you'll read the whole book, is A Black Theology of Liberation. He's also known for one of his later books. 2018, he wrote The Cross and the Lynching Tree, that won the Book of the Year award in religion. So listen now to James Cone's question.
If God is in the world where people are abused and exploited, what then is God doing? This was my question as I wrestled with the fire that was burning inside me. Christians are called by God to plunge themselves into the world on behalf of those who are voiceless and hurt. The great Russian writer Dostoevsky said, quote, "There is only one thing I dread, not to be worthy of my suffering," unquote. As I reflected on that saying in relation to Black suffering, I said, there is only one thing I dread, not to be worthy of the life that the suffering of my Black ancestors have made possible for me.
James Cone plunged himself as a Christian into the world around him for the sake of others. And he brought his questions. He brought his theological questions to God, wondering how God would speak into that suffering. He believed in a God who was on the side of the oppressed. And we will read about his reflections on that God throughout this year, beginning this week. So I want to introduce you here to James Cone. One of the other books we'll be reading this year is by Daniel Migliore. He wrote a book called Faith Seeking Understanding that functions a bit like a theological textbook. And it's worth thinking with Migliore for a minute about what faith seeking understanding means. For him, faith seeks understanding because God is bigger than all our ideas about God. And our situation is always changing. So our faith then needs to seek understanding as we seek to understand who that God is that's bigger than all our ideas about God, as our situations, our contexts are ever changing. Migliore was a professor of systematic theology at Princeton Theological Seminary. He has retired. He's a pastor in the Presbyterian Church USA, and he offers a reformed perspective on many of the theological questions that we'll be looking at this year. This is the cover of the 4th edition of his book that just came out this year. And he writes that human life ceases to be human, not when we do not have all the answers, but when we no longer have the courage to ask the really important questions. One of the goals of this course is to ask really important questions, and then to seek answers to those questions together. So together we'll be a learning community who will think theologically with one another. And so it's worth then asking the question of what is theology? Katie Geneva Cannon, who taught theology at Union Presbyterian Seminary in Richmond for many years, has this to say in response to that question of what is theology.
Identity, I think, is essential for agency, that we got to know who we are. That philosophical statement, to thy own self be true. If we don't know who self is, how can we be true to self? Or the golden rule, do unto others, you have them do unto you. Love your neighbor as you love yourself. If you don't love self, you can't love neighbor. And so one of the things that I'm grateful for in my theological education is letting go of the warped Christianity that I learned in my home church and in my family life, which is the kind of Christianity that stomps out the self, that says it's what joy is Jesus, others, and you. And it's like, no, joy is you got to know you first, got to know self first. Because if I put other people, what the warped Christianity allowed me to do was make myself into a doormat, allowed me to consent to my own abuse, allowed people to take advantage of me, allowed me to put blinders on and put my head in the sand and ignore and not listen to my gut, not listen to the antenna going up, not listen to when I was in harm's way.
So Cannon is here to talk to us about identity. And as we ask these theological questions this semester, it will raise questions of identity. Who am I? How do I understand myself? Who am I in light of who God is? Who is God? In light of who God is, who am I? So I encourage you to listen to those questions that are raised as you think about your identity, as we think theologically with one another. So what is theology? Charlie Brown and Snoopy have some ideas. Charlie Brown says to Snoopy, I hear you're writing a book on theology. I hope you have a good title. Snoopy thinks, I have the perfect title. Has it ever occurred to you that you might be wrong? So a lot of the work in theology class is going to be writing, and writing with enough humility to consider the fact that there might be other perspectives, that someone else may give a different answer to the same question. And then we might have something to learn from the answers that other folks give, whether those people are classmates, whether they're instructors, whether they are authors that we read. One of the tasks of theology is to ask questions and to ask questions with sufficient curiosity as to be curious about the answers. So what is theology? It is simply God talk. It's theologos. Theo being the Greek word for God, logos being about talk and words. So theologos, God talk. What is theology? There's everyday theology and second order theology. What this means is that everyday theology is the stuff we go around thinking about. When I interviewed for my position here at Columbia, I had lunch with students one day, and there was a student who said, I don't like theology class because I'm not a theologian. Yes, she was a student here at Columbia Theological Seminary. And I said to her, well, I'm sorry, I don't agree. I think that anyone that has questions about God, any thoughts about God, is a theologian by definition. It comes with the territory. So all humans are theologians. And so there's a theology we do every day, just trying to make sense of the world around us. And then second order theology becomes the writing of these thoughts down. The writing down and reflecting upon the ways that God's at work in the world. And when we start with this process from the position of Christian faith, when we start with faith and then seek to understand that, this becomes the process of faith seeking understanding. So Migliore defines this on page 9 in his book. The theology is the continuous process of inquiry that is prompted both by the surprising grace of God and by the distance between the promise of God's coming reign on the one hand and our experience of the brokenness of human life on the other. So we are in this continuous process between the promise of God's reign and God's triumph and the experience that we have on a daily basis of the brokenness of human life. The theologian Karl Barth defines theology as rational wrestling with the mystery. Ultimately, God is a mystery. God is bigger than we can ever understand or comprehend or describe. And yet the work of theology is to take that mystery and to wrestle with it as best that we are able, to make arguments about it, to make descriptions, to describe what we think we understand, what we think we know, and to wrestle then with the mystery. All right, so looking ahead to our readings for this week 1, we've got reading from Cone, we've got reading from Migliore, and we have reading from Gustavo Gutierrez. Gutierrez is a Dominican priest from Peru, one of the founders of liberation theology. Cone is one of the founders of Black liberation theology, and at the same time, Gutierrez in Peru was writing his book, A Theology of Liberation, that we're reading a chapter from for this week. And then we have readings where we're going to hear from Kwok Poo-leon. Know that Kwok Poo-leon is born in Hong Kong, which means that Kwok, the name that we say first, is actually her surname, and that her first name is Poo-leon. So when in writing, when you talk about her, you're going to say Kwok, as using her surname to describe whatever she has to say. So she was formerly taught at Episcopal Divinity School up in Boston. Now she is a professor of theology and spirituality at the Candler School of Theology at Emory University, just up the road. She's got a PhD from Harvard University. We're reading from her book, Postcolonial Imagination and Feminist Theology, this week, that she wrote in 2005. But she's the author of many books and articles on theological topics. We also get to hear from Emily Towns. Emily Towns is currently the Dean of the Divinity School at Vanderbilt, where she's also a professor of womanist ethics and society. She's an ordained American Baptist clergywoman. Kwok, by the way, is Anglican. And Towns formerly taught at Yale Divinity School and at Union Theological Seminary. And we're reading from her book this week on womanist ethics and the cultural production of evil that she wrote in 2006. So I'm going to get to some reading questions that I have for you all. But what we're seeing this week is we're seeing these authors give their understandings of what theology is. You're being asked to do a similar task. You're being asked to write an I believe statement. You'll find the instructions in the syllabus, but you get to offer what your understanding is as of this moment on a number of different topics that we'll be looking at this semester. Don't worry, this assignment's not graded, but we use it as a way for you to articulate what you think you understand now. And then we'll read and we'll think together and we'll learn, and we'll have opportunities at the midterm and the final for you to review what you said now and to see whether you agree with yourself or if you change or articulate in a different way any of these claims. So know that's why you're doing it, so that you get to be about a similar task of writing theologically yourself in these I believe statements. So I've got some reading questions here for you. These set of three questions apply to the readings from Miliori, Cone, and Gutierrez. You want to look at what each author's definition of theology is. You want to know what each of them believes the task of theology to be. And then you want to be able to summarize each author's argument in their chapter. And then there's 4 questions here for Kwok. And you can download all of these. And then there's also 4 questions on towns. This is just a way to get you started as we start the semester and you think about these readings with one another. So looking forward to a wonderful semester together. Let us know if you have any questions at all. And I hope this is a helpful introduction to those readings and a bit of what we'll be about.